Reverie and Interpretation, Thomas H. Ogden, Ch4. Privacy, Reverie, and Analytic Technique. Part 2. Recasting the Fundamental Rule. Although the term fundamental rule was not introduced by Freud until 1912, the concept was always a central part of Freud's 1900 thinking about analytic technique in the interpretation of dreams. In 1913, Freud made his most fully elaborated statement regarding the fundamental rule of psychoanalytic technique, which the patient has to observe, p. 130, for this must be imparted to him, the analysand at the very beginning. One more thing before you start. What you tell me must differ, in one respect, from an ordinary conversation. You will be tempted to say to yourself that this or that is irrelevant here, or quite unimportant, or nonsensical, so that there is no need to say it. You must never give in to these criticisms, but must say it spite of them indeed. You must say it precisely because you feel an aversion to doing so. So say whatever goes through your mind. Finally, never forget that you have promised to be absolutely honest, and never leave anything out because, for some reason or other, it is unpleasant to tell it. Pages 134-135. A recent review of the literature, Lichtenberg and Galler 1987, revealed that very few papers in the literature have as their main topic a modification in the fundamental rule, and only slightly more suggest modifications in passing. Page 52. In a more fully elaborated commentary on the fundamental rule, Ch4 1991 states, special circumstances can arise in which it is advisable to follow a path other than the usual one, without this meaning in any way that we can depart from the fundamental rule. p. 65. There are several aspects of the question of the fundamental rule that I shall address. It seems to me that any consideration of the role of the fundamental rule must begin by relating this aspect of technique to our conception of the analytic process as a whole, since technique must facilitate process. Viewed very broadly, psychoanalysis might be described as a psychological interpersonal process intended to enhance the analysand's capacity to be alive as a human being. Although a great many analysts have made pivotal contributions to this conception of analysis, Winnicott is perhaps the principal architect of a modern conception of psychoanalysis in which the central focus of the analytic process has been broadened from the task of making the unconscious conscious, in the language of the topographic model, or of transforming ID into ego, in the language of the structural model. The analytic process for Winnicott 1971b has as its central concern the expansion of the capacity of analyst and analysand to create a place to live in an area of experiencing that lies between reality and fantasy. The psychoanalytic process, as conceived by Winnicott, demands of analytic technique a full appreciation of the importance of the generative tension between privacy and interpersonal relatedness. Although healthy persons communicate and enjoy communicating, the other fact is equally true, that each individual is an isolate, permanently non-communicating, permanently unknown, in fact, unfound. At the center of each human being is an incommunicado element, and this is sacred and most worthy of preservation. Winnicott 1963, page 187. On the basis of this conception of what it is to be human, Winnicott comments on psychoanalysis as a theory. Although the implications of his comments for analytic technique are clear, we can understand the hatred people have of psychoanalysis, which has penetrated a long way into the human personality, and which provides a threat to the human individual in his need to be secretly isolated. p. 187. A bit later he adds, we must ask ourselves, does our technique allow for the patient to communicate that he or she is not communicating? Page 188. It is this question that forms the backdrop for my own re-examination of the fundamental rule. In previous contributions, Ogden 1989a, B 1991b, I have discussed my own conception of the role of personal isolation in protecting the individual against the continuous strain that is an inescapable part of living in the unpredictable matrix of human-object relations. 1991b. Point 1 have emphasized the life-sustaining role of sensation-dominated, autistic contiguous. 1989b. Forms of experience in the creation of a temporary suspension of relatedness both to the mother/analyst as object and to that mother/analyst as environment. As a result of this view of the central role of privacy/personal isolation in healthy human experience, I do not in my own practice of analysis instruct the patient to attempt to say everything that comes to mind regardless of how illogical or embarrassing or trivial or seemingly irrelevant, Greenson 1971, page 102, it may seem. Neither do I believe that it is sufficient to soften the fundamental rule with comments such as, I understand that the task of saying everything that comes to mind is a difficult or impossible one. Instead, it is my practice to simply invite the patient, in an unspoken way, to begin the analysis by conducting myself in the initial meetings in a way that provides the patient a sense of what it means to be in analysis. Ogden 1989b. In the opening moments of the first meeting, I may say nothing or may ask the patient, where should we begin? My effort is to introduce the patient in the initial meeting, and in every subsequent meeting, to the nature of an analytic dialogue, which is characterized by a combination of qualities that the analysand will not have encountered elsewhere, since the analytic dialogue is different from every other form of human discourse. I attempt to do this in a way that does not announce itself as a technique, i.e., as a stagnant, prescribed form. The fundamental rule current analytic practice is in danger of becoming a frozen injunction for both analyst and analysand. It is often treated as a static, unexamined fixture in the analytic landscape, carrying all the stifling power of Freud's 1913 repeated use of the words must and insist in his description of the introduction of the analysand to the fundamental rule. It seems to me antithetical to the effort to generate an analytic process to exhort the patient to say everything that comes to mind. To do so would run counter to my conception of the analytic experience as being grounded in the dialectical interplay of the capacities of analyst and analysand for reverie. Ogden 1994, AD. It is as important for a patient to know that he is free to be silent as it is for him to know that he is free to speak. To privilege speaking over silence, disclosure over privacy, communicating over not communicating, seems as unanalytic as it would be to privilege the positive transference over the negative transference. Gratitude over envy, love over hate. The depressive mode of generating experience over the paranoid schizoid and autistic contiguous modes of generating experience. Ogden 1986. 1988b. It is the point at which these dialectics, for example, the dialectical tension of love and hate, disclosure and privacy, communicating and not communicating, have collapsed in one direction or another, for example. When an overvaluation of disclosure has led to the equation of privacy and resistance, that the individual or the analytic pair has entered the realm of psychopathology. From this perspective, psychopathology involves a variety of forms of failure of the individual or of the analytic pair to come to life in a process of generating and preserving these dialectical tensions, and instead becoming engaged in creating substitutes for the experience of aliveness, for example, in the form of perverse pleasure, manic excitement, as-if constructions, and so on. I believe that to begin or found the analytic enterprise on a stated or unstated ideal that embodies a collapse of the dialectical tension of communicating and not communicating in the direction of disclosure represents an invitation into a pathological relationship. The outcome is often the creation of an iatrogenic illness, in which the capacity for reverie is paralyzed or driven into hiding, thus making it significantly less likely that a genuine analytic process will ever take place. At this point, I would like to offer a brief clinical example of a collapse of the dialectic of privacy and communication that resulted in an experience of psychological deadness. I was consulted by Dr. E about an analysis he was conducting that had felt stagnant to him for several years. The analyst felt depressed by the patient, Ms. J, although Dr. E said that he quite liked her. The analyst told me that he often wished that he could decrease the frequency of sessions from 5 times per week to 2 or 3 times per week, or perhaps terminate the analysis altogether. In the course of the extended consultation, I asked Dr. E to present process notes from several sessions, including a detailed account of his countertransference responses to the patient. Dr. E described the way in which the patient would fill the hours with apparently introspective talk that seemed to go nowhere. He told me that he often struggled to fight off sleep. Dr. E added that his description of the feeling of the analysis would be incomplete if he omitted the fact that there were times when he felt painfully self-conscious during the sessions with this patient. Dr. E said that Ms. J could be extremely cutting in her always perceptive critique of his taste in clothing, slight weight changes, deportment, office decoration, and so on. Such comments were offered apologetically by the patient and were often prefaced by such remarks as, "I'm afraid I'll offend you or hurt you if I tell you what I'm thinking." In one of few dreams reported by the analysand, she was in a public place needing to take a shower, but found that none of the stalls had shower curtains. There was a modest, unassuming door that looked like a bathroom, which led to a lovely apartment decorated in the patient's favorite colors, deep reds and browns. Ms. J said that she had no thoughts about the dream. I wondered aloud with Dr. E whether the dream might have reflected a painful, and thus far unspoken, feeling of lack of privacy in the transference-countertransference. The modest door led to a living space, a space where the patient could be alive in privacy. It was a place that reflected a style of her own. I said that the deep red and brown colors seemed to suggest that sexual aliveness was part of what was being imagined and experienced by the patient in the dream, and perhaps wished for in the transference. In the course of the discussion of this dream, I asked Dr. E whether he had told Ms. J that it was her task to say everything that came to mind. He said that he had told this to the patient at the beginning of the analysis, 7 years earlier, but that this instruction had not been mentioned since then by either of them. I raised the possibility with Dr. E that his feelings of being painfully and intrusively seen and exposed by Ms. J may reflect something of the patient's projected experience of being sadistically robbed of her own inner world. It seemed possible that this fantasy destructive plundering was occurring because both the analyst and analysand had subjugated themselves to an imagined authority, the fundamental rule, and all that it symbolized for both Dr. E and for the patient. Of course, no single factor, such as the analyst instructing the patient to say everything that comes to mind, will determine the course of an analysis. In the case being discussed, the analyst's instructions regarding the fundamental rule were a manifestation of an evolving intersubjective construction in which analyst and analysand were ensnared. A thorough discussion of this aspect of the transference-countertransference occurred over the succeeding months of consultation. One element in this discussion involved Dr. E's telling me that he had taken the fundamental rule as a given in part because it had served as a major component of the context in which his own analysis had been conducted. Dr. E recognized in his own non-self-reflective that NES about this aspect of the analytic interaction and acting out of his resentment about this aspect of his own experience in analysis and suspected, on the basis of further reveries occurring during the sessions with Ms. J, that he was involved in a fantasied, retaliatory reversal of roles in the current analysis. Dr. E eventually told the patient that recent events in the analysis had reminded him of Ms. J's dream about the public showers that lacked shower curtains. He connected this image in part to his having instructed her to say everything that came to mind. Dr. E told the patient that he hoped that analyses that he conducted would result in changes in him as well as in the patient. One change that had occurred over the previous 7 years was his feeling about asking a patient to say everything that comes to mind. Showers should have shower curtains and analyses should have a place for privacy. The patient was greatly relieved by Dr. E's comments. Later in the session, she said that it had meant a great deal to her that he had spoken to her with such candor. Dr. E told me that he could not recall Ms. J's ever having expressed gratitude to him in so direct and moving a way. Reconceiving the fundamental rule. If I were to put into words for myself my view of the analysand's role in relation to communicating and not communicating in the analytic setting, I suppose it would begin with the notion that communicating and privacy are each to be valued as dimensions of human experience, each creating and preserving the vitality, the sense of real, Winnicott 1963, page 184, of the individual and of the analytic experience. Formulated as a brief statement to an analysand, it might take the following form. I view our meetings as a time for you to say what you want to say when you want to say it, and for me to respond in my own way. At the same time, there must always be a place for privacy for both of us. This is a long, rather awkward statement, and I am not sure that I have ever said this in precisely this way to an analysand. The statement sounds stilted to me. I think in part because it is an imaginary comment devoid of the personal context of a specific human interaction. Nonetheless, it captures a good deal of what I often say to myself, and, when the occasion arises, what I talk about with the patient. Point 2. 2. This view of the role of the analysand overlaps brief comments made by Altman, 1976, and Gill, Personal Communication, reported by Epstein, 1976, concerning their own versions of the fundamental rule. Altman, 1976, suggests speaking to the patient in a way that conveys to the analysand that the analysand is entitled to say anything. Page 59. Gill, Personal Communication, reported by Epstein, 1976, suggests saying to the analysand, you may say whatever you wish. Page 54. These two statements overlap with my own thinking, although they place far less emphasis than I do on the centrality of the role of privacy in the analytic experience. It is not infrequent that the analysand will have either read about the fundamental rule or devised a version of it for himself, for example, on the basis of experience with parents who were felt to require him to tell all, or learned about the fundamental rule through experience in one or more previous analyses. Under such circumstances, it has been essential for me to talk with the patient about his conception of the rules of analysis relating to free association, i.e., his rules concerning the relationship between what is said and what is left unsaid, between what must be made public and what is allowed to remain private. Several patients have told me that on the basis of their experiences in previous analyses, they had come to assume that all analyses would eventually evolve into two conversations, one spoken, one secret, because of the rule about saying everything. Eventually, in the course of these discussions, I have clarified that my own conception of analysis does not require the analysand to attempt to say everything that comes to mind. Both the analysand and I must always be as free to communicate with ourselves, both in the form of words and sensations, as we are free to communicate with one another. It has not been my experience in analyses I have conducted or supervised that an analytic space in which privacy is valued as much as communication leads to analytic impasses in which silence, for example, comes to serve as an unanalyzable form of resistance. When extended defensive silences have occurred, I have found it to be important to acknowledge and interpret both the patient's need for privacy and his need to make a transference communication through silence. Coltet 1991. The transference communication that is made through silence is often a form of transference, as total situation, Joseph 1985. Over time in an analysis, the idea of the analysand saying only what he wants to say and holding privacy as sacred, Winnicott 1963, proves to be more complicated than it first appears, since the analysand is of course not always clear about what it is that he would like to say or even who he is. The analysand finds that the first person singular is in fact plural. There are many I's. After all, the patient wants to say certain things while he, another aspect of his experience of himself, find that he cannot bring himself to say these things that he wants to say. Moreover, there are things that he feels he would like to say, but does not know what they are. See Ogden 1992a. B for a discussion of the dialectically constituted / disentiered subject of psychoanalysis. It is an important development in an analysis when an analysand becomes able to differentiate and understand something of the relationship between different aspects of himself, for example, between his not wishing to say something, because he wants to keep it to himself for the time being, and his not feeling able to say something while hoping that the analyst will help him find a way to be able to put into words. Such conflicts between different aspects of self-experience often remain unrecognized, and therefore unanalyzable, when an analysis is conducted under the aegis of the analyst statement of, and the patient's partially defensive use of, the fundamental rule. This type of impasse may take the form of the patient's unconscious fantasy that analysis requires the patient to submit to a type of psychic evisceration. The unconscious object relations constituting this fantasy remain unanalyzable, so long as the analyst is unself-reflectively imposing an actual experiential context that is governed by the expectation / demand that the analysand say everything that comes to mind. The role of the analyst and the fundamental rule. Freud, 1923a, believed that the fundamental rule of free association has its counterpart in the analyst's effort to surrender himself to his own unconscious mental activity in a state of evenly suspended attention. Pt2-Ogden-Reverie. The analyst attempts to avoid so far as possible reflection and the construction of conscious expectations, and attempts not to try to fix anything that he heard particularly in his memory, and by these means to catch the drift of the patient's unconscious with his own unconscious. Pt2-Ogden-Reverie. The analyst's work of interpretation is not to be brought under strict rules and leaves a great deal of play to the physician's tact and skill. Pt2-Ogden-Reverie. Or, to put it purely in terms of technique, he, the analyst, should simply listen and not bother about whether he is keeping anything in mind. 1912, page 112. Freud's emphasis in describing the work of the analyst is right on the analyst seeing or revealing everything, even to himself, but on creating conditions for a particular sort of receptivity and play of the mind. Freud asks the analyst to attempt to allow his own unconscious to enter into a resonance with the unconscious of the patient. The analyst, in simply listening, attempts not to get a fix, not to remember or understand too much, and instead simply to use his own state of unconscious receptivity to get a sense of, to catch the drift of, the patient's unconscious experience. It seems to me that the psychological state described here by Freud as simply listening is the same psychological state that Bion, 1962a, refers to as reverie, a state characterized by the absence of memory and desire, by 1967. Although the analyst's state of unconscious receptivity to the unconscious of the analysand is described as the analyst giving equal notice, Freud 1912, page 112, to himself, i.e., as the counterpart of the demand made on the patient in the fundamental rule, the effort to enter into a state of evenly suspended attention, Freud 1912, page 111, seems hardly to represent equal notice to the demand that the analysand say everything that comes to mind. If the demand made on the patient, or better, the role assigned to the patient, were genuinely complementary in nature to the role Freud envisioned for the analyst in the process of creating a state of evenly suspended attention, I believe that the analytic pair could more easily enter into a type of relatedness in which it is possible for both the analyst and the analysand to catch the drift of, get a sense of, the current of the unconscious constructions being generated in the analysis. Under these conditions, analyst and analysand are each in a position to turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ toward the transmitting unconscious, Freud 1912, page 115, of the other and toward the jointly, but asymmetrically, created unconscious constructions of the analytic third.